Thank you, and welcome to the Immersive Learning Research Network's 9th annual conference. This is our opening keynote with Mr. Kent Bai. I'm so happy to be able to introduce Kent to the stage. Just a quick bio. Since May 2014, Kent Bai has published over 1,200 Voices of VR podcast interviews featuring the pioneering artists, storytellers, and technologists driving the resurgence of virtual and augmented reality. He's an oral historian, experiential journalist, and aspiring philosopher, helping to define the patterns of immersive storytelling, experiential design, ethical frameworks, and the ultimate potential of XR. I first met Kent here on the iLRN virtual campus when it was just opening prior to the iLRN2023 conference near the onset of the pandemic. He's insightful, inquisitive, and diplomatic. Of course, for those few of you who do not know Kent or his work on Voices of VR, he's not only a visitor to and reporting from most corners of the metaverse, but he often plays key roles as a moderator and a strong, informed voice for many XR and immersive learning organizations. He seems to have boundless energy and enthusiasm, as well as an incredibly informed perspective. I remember a few years ago his moderating role for the IEEE Standards Forum, his capacity to negotiate a veritable whirlwind of perspectives on technical, operational, ethical, and emotional perspectives, including fielding my own obscure, rather abstract question about evolving new technologies with potentially new interaction patterns. He's a gentleman and a scholar. Will you please welcome Mr. Kent Bai?
All right, just want to look at everybody before I go back. Now I'm looking at my screen. Thank you so much for that amazing introduction, Jonathan. And today I'm going to be giving some reflections on XR and AI and education. And I've shared the link in the chat. You can go to get the direct link to my slides, or if you scan this QR code, if you're watching the video, it'll go to my slide share and you can take a look at the slides. There's a lot of slides, more than you're probably able to digest in this talk, but hopefully you'll be able to get an overview and go back and be able to refer to these slides with lots of footnotes and be able to dig into more details. All right, so today I'm going to be doing a brief overview of some of the learning models. I'm going to be giving my elemental theory of presence, and then actually had a chance to read through, or actually look at all the videos that were on the YouTube for iLRN, look at all the papers, and try to give some highlights of what's at this conference through the lens of this elemental lens of presence. Assessment is a topic that came up, and I have a few thoughts on that, and then theories of change, and then I'll end up with AI ethics and privacy, as that's an emerging topic. All right, so let's do a brief overview of learning models. For most people in this room, you'll probably be well aware of all these learning models, probably way more than I'm even aware of. But as I was going through the different talks, there's some that came up again and again. So there's usually they have the 3 learning domains of the cognitive skills, affective skills, and psychomotor skills. But I would add another one, which is the more embodied aspect of embodied cognition. So there's a cognitive domain of Bloom's taxonomy that has the remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, create. That came up again and again as people were designing different immersive experiences. Then you have the affective domain, Craft World, which I guess is more of both the motivation and the emotions and the affect as you're thinking about these immersive experiences. Then you have the psychomotor domain, of the kind of starting with the reflexes and moving up to higher levels of both physical activities and skilled movements, and eventually this kind of embodied nonverbal communication. And then you get into embodied cognition, which includes both the body and the world in this loop. And another way that I like to think about it is in this kind of nested hierarchy where the brain is embedded in the context of the body and the body's in the context of the environment. So our cognition is not only a function of what's happening throughout the course of our entire body, but also the environments that we're in. So when we're in these immersive environments, you're able to both modulate how we move and how we think by changing the environments that we're in. So, just taking a quick look at some models of perception and cognition, you have this sensory experience and the mental models of reality, and what is often referred to as the predictive coding theory of neuroscience, where you're perceiving things, but your perceptions are being weighed against your priors, everything that all those mental models and schemas that you have And so when you're in these immersive environments in virtual reality, then you're able to kind of trick your brain into actually being in those places, but you're building upon a lifetime of embodied experiences that make those experiences even more rich. So Frank Steinecke back at IEEE 2021 started to give through this whole perceptual loop with virtual reality, where you have this loop between perception and cognition and action, where at each one of those phases you can have virtual reality do perceptual filtering or selective attention or motor adaptation, but you have this kind of loop of our consciousness that goes between the perception of the outside world, how we make sense of it, and ultimately we are moving machines. We are taking action in the world. And so and in some ways, when you think about those different domains, they're all also kind of seamlessly together in these loops and kind of melded together in a certain way. And I'll break it down a little bit more and how I think about it in my theory of presence. There's also Aneta's framework for serious education, game design, all these different I's from identity, immersion, interactivity, increasing complexity, informed teaching, and instructional. And again, it's kind of like this nested hierarchy where at the core, it's your identity and yourself and your embodiment, and you have these immersions and interactivities. So another lens of looking at some of these same things. Dalgarno and Lee had a model from 2010, which is a 3D virtual learning environments, where you start to see different aspects of the way that the technology is embedded in there, and you have these represent the different level of fidelity that you have in that environment, but also how the learner's interacting. And then from the phenomenological perspective, you have the degree that you're present in that experience, either from your own embodiment, but also co-present with other people, but also it sort of helps form your embodiment and identity through the avatar representation. So this is one model of thinking about what happens in VR. And then iLRN, I went through and did a sampling of the different presentations and tried to see some different themes as different folks were highlighting what are the affordances of virtual reality. So we have Carl on here with immersion, presence, and interaction. We have Carl Sater with spatial design, gamification, integrated feedback, and immersion. You have Lamoro, I'm sorry if I'm butchering the pronunciation, but Lamoro et al. With the different design principles of integrating microlearning and valuing collaboration and social learning, gamification for motivation, empowering students as creators and innovators, learning journal for assessment, and then challenging students to be sustainable problem finders and solvers. So again, having the students go out and actually problem solve. So, taking agency and trying to actually solve some of these big intractable problems. Jiang also has these different modules of if it's immersive, personalized, modular, game-based, and accessible. And then finally, we have the XR learning affordances of spatial knowledge, experiential learning, engagement, contextualization, and collaboration. So hopefully that gives you a good sense of some of the different discussion of what are the different unique affordances of virtuality. And I'm going to dig into how I start to see it through this elemental theory of presence, that I start to make sense of some of these same things. So I've given a whole talk on this that is a whole hour long, that is a much more deeper dive than I'm going to be able to do here. So I refer you to this presentation that I gave online, where you can get a little bit more information on this. But back in 2014 at Oculus Connect 1, Brendan Irbe, the CEO of Oculus, got up on stage and at the tech conference is telling the entire community that presence is one of the key components of virtual reality. And for anybody who's been involved with virtual reality for a number of years, you know that there's this sort of subtle phenomenological experience of actually being in another place. So Mel Slater describes this in two primary illusions. It's the place illusion and the plausibility illusion. The place illusion is that you get the strong illusion that you're in another place despite knowing that you're not actually there. And the plausibility illusion is that the illusion that is what is apparently happening is actually happening, even though you know for sure it's not. There's a lot of the kind of illusionary framing that both myself and David Chalmers disagree with, in terms of there's a, David Chalmers in his book Reality Plus argues that virtual reality is a genuine reality. And so I think there's a caution here in terms of seeing what is real and whatnot. It gets into deeper philosophical, metaphysical debates that are beyond the scope of this conversation, but I just want to flag that you don't always have to flag it as illusion, especially when you talk about emotions and social dynamics and embodied experiences and agency. That's where it starts to have a less of a difference when it comes to virtual embodiment versus physical embodiment. But nonetheless, I like to think about these different qualities of presence as active presence, mental and social presence, emotional presence, and embodied and environmental presence. which you can probably see some parallel between these different learning domains. But I also like to look at it through the lens of these different communication media. So you have video games where you have active presence. That's all about interactivity and agency, expressing your will, you're engaging in the experience, you're exploring, you're being creative, you're making stuff, you're solving problems, you're taking initiative, you have a desire, you want to have a question be answered. That's all the active presence. The mental and social presence are all the ways in which that language is and abstractions allow us to communicate with other people through social dynamics, but also through literature and writing and narration and the World Wide Web and the internet and social media and podcasting. So this whole level of mental and social presence for literature and those other domains. And then emotional presence is, if you think of the films, when you watch a film, you can't take any agency, and it's a lot about modulating your emotions. It's really deeply emotionally engaging and moving, deeply immersive. You have music and lighting, you have different shades that kind of like affect your moods in subtle ways. And then you have the embodied and environmental presence. This is what's new with virtual and augmented reality. You have all your sensory experiences, you have the spatial dimensions of things like architecture and theater and dance. And it's like this new aspect of virtual reality that's unique and different, this actually transportive quality that makes you feel like you're actually there. And then you have embodiment and you have a representation of yourself in these experiences. And so if you boil it down, it's taking action, making choices, emotional immersion, and sensory experience. So you can take a look at these different communication media as it progresses from oral storytelling to theater, books, film, radio, TV, video games, internet, mobile phone, and then now with virtual augmented reality and immersive theater. You see that each subsequent media is incorporating all the different dimensions of the previous media, and that each of the different communication media have a bit of a center of gravity, but they all also kind of include aspects of the previous media. So you can see like video games is all about agency, and virtual and augmented reality has a center of gravity of embodiment and environmental presence, even though you can still do all the things that are incorporated in the other media. So again, it's active presence, mental social presence, emotional presence, and embodied and environmental presence. So if we go back to the 4 learning domains of the cognitive skills, affective skills, and psychomotor skills, and embodied cognition, we can break it down into the active presence of the psychomotor domain, the mental and social presence of the cognitive domain, the emotional presence of the affective domain, and then, like I said, there's no embodiment in those 3 domains, and so I would add the 4th there of embodied cognition, because I actually think that embodied cognition, through the lens of embodied cognition, kind of ties everything together into this more integrated, seamless loop. So I'm not going to read all of these different aspects, or I'll refer you to the slide that you can look at later, but it's all these different dimensions of agency, mental social presence. Yeah, I'll just pause here for a second. You can look at it for a moment, and then I'll move on. So again, back to active presence, mental social presence, emotional presence, and embodied and environmental presence. And these different communication media that are at the center of gravity. And like I said, they're all kind of happening all at the same time, and there's different center of gravities for each of these. Okay, so if we go back to Slater's place illusion and plausibility illusion, you can see that the plausibility illusion is all about your mental construct of whether or not you believe in whatever. It's kind of tricking, it's a suspension of disbelief. So it's like your mental model is expecting enough that it's kind of tricking your mind that it's plausible enough that it's real. And then there's the place illusion that you're actually transported into the other place. That's the environmental and embodied presence. Now, Slater has emphasized originally the perceptual and sensory motor contingencies of VR. When I first did an interview with him a couple of times, he was adamant that social presence wasn't a part of these dimensions of presence. He was only looking strictly at the things that were very unique to virtual reality from a neuroscience perspective. And also he had this kind of illusionary framing, so it was problematic to say that social dynamics and social interactions that you had in these immersive spaces were somehow not real. And so, but over time, in 2022, he actually went back and updated his primary illusions and actually added both the body ownership illusion, which is that aspect of embodiment, but also co-presence, which starts to have more of these aspects of social dimensions within his kind of core illusionary aspects of, or the core aspects of virtual reality. So you have the plausibility illusion and the co-presence illusion, and the place illusion and the body ownership illusion, aka embodiment. Again, there's nothing explicitly about agency or emotions in his theory at this point, but I sort of carve those out, especially since you have the affective domain in the learning context, it has its own unique domain. So Richard Skarbez is a presence researcher, and he's done a survey back in 2017, and he actually alerted me to some other researchers that were very similar to what I was working on. But he did a whole survey of all these different existing presence researchers and try to categorize them into the different elemental components. And then he came up with this kind of category for trying to make sense of all of them. Again, he started with the place illusion and plausibility illusion, and so he's adding in here the social presence illusion and the co-presence illusion. Again, the illusionary language I disagree with, because when you have social interactions, it doesn't necessarily, you know that you're not actually with these people, but the quality of those social interactions feel just as genuine and legitimate as, say, talking to someone on the telephone. You don't say, I had an illusionary conversation with my mother on the phone for Mother's Day. No, you just say you talk to your mom. So I feel like I'm sort of pushing back against that kind of illusionary framing. So again, he's adding the plausibility illusion, social presence and co-presence, and place illusion. So Skarbez actually took me off to Dustin Chertoff. I asked him, hey, do you know of anybody who has anything similar to what I've done with the kind of elemental theory? And it actually ended up being very similar. So Dustin Chertoff, back in 2008, 2010, way before I was even into VR, for his thesis project, he started to look into experiential design, and because he was dissatisfied for the ways that the academic community of the VR community didn't have all the different components that he wanted to see for the different aspects of presence. I kind of independently came to a similar conclusion later, but he was looking at again, he did a whole survey of all the different presence components. And so he came up with these 5 ones, which is the sensory, cognitive, affective, active, and relational. And if we kind of put it into mind mapping, it's the active, cognitive, and relational, affective, and sensory. So he's drawing upon experiential marketing. So these are marketers who are trying to figure out, as you have people get more and more engaged to these different experiential marketing campaigns where it's branding, but like when you go to Starbucks, it becomes a whole experience of the song that's playing, and that you create a whole culture and a whole vibe that goes beyond just kind of like the surface level of a brand association. It becomes a whole immersive experience. And so the marketers have been at the forefront of trying to define these different experiential modules. And so 1999, you have Schmidt with sense, feel, think, act, and relate. So again, that's act, think, and relate, sense, and feel. And then you have measuring brain experiences in 2009, where you have the sensory, affective, behavioral, and intellectual. So you have behavioral, intellectual, affective, and sensory. Okay, so then you go back to Carl Jung back in 1921, and he was very inspired by the elements. And so he was boiling all down to thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. So intuition, thinking, feeling, and sensing. And part of the reason why I'm going through all these different iterations is that Jung had this idea of the archetype, and the archetype, you can't necessarily boil it down to like a strict formula. It's more of a multivalent complex that becomes very complex, very interrelational, but it's very difficult to pin down. And so I see these elements as having this archetypal quality that is encompassing all these different things, that when I look at all these different immersive learning theories, it ends up kind of repeating what is essentially the same thing, but rather than kind of putting them into the same buckets. So Skarbez did a whole survey of presence back in 2017, and I went through and tried to the best of my ability, start to categorize how I would start to put each of those different components that he's isolating down into this. Again, I'm not going to read all the different aspects in the slide. I'll pause here for a moment, and you can look at it later as well. All right, so again, active presence, mental and social presence, emotional presence, and embodied and environmental presence. Okay, so now let's start to dive through some of the different iLRN papers through this presence lens. So like I said, I watched all the different videos and tried to take screenshots and annotate them and just kind of make sense of, okay, how would you take a first pass of understanding what's happening here at iLRN 2023? Okay, so let's start with embodied and environmental presence. Okay, so actually I have also other references that I'm pulling in, like this one, and also University of Michigan had a number of different talks about XR education, so I'm including some of those slides from that as well. But Jeremy Balanson, in his book Experience on Demand, identified what he now refers to as this DICE acronym, which is dangerous, impossible, counterproductive, and expensive. So this is a good baseline to say, hey, if there's something that's really dangerous and to do in physical reality, then you should consider doing it within virtual reality. So if you're dealing with like things that could put your physical mortality in danger, consider doing it in virtual reality. So whether that's military training or dealing with nuclear waste or a whole wide range of different things that people have to do that are putting their life at stake. And it's much better to get the testing and the training in a virtual environment than doing it in physical reality. So that's from his book. And then there's a number of different immersive experiences that you go into the different worlds. This happened to be about the Sustainable Development Goals and trying to put using the Frame VR. It's a free application, and building out different worlds. You have these different posters with words, but you get this kind of immersive environment of these nature scenes that are kind of thematically tied to what the topic is, and it creates this larger context that helps with communicating whatever the message is. So there's a piece by Tahiri that is this virtual reality application for learning geometry, and they were saying that they were doing this continuous feedback with haptics. So each step along the way, you're getting this haptic feedback. So as you have this haptic feedback, it's getting this continual feedback that you're either on or off the right direction. So thinking about this multimodal ways of having both the spatial representation, but also your embodied interactions and embodied cognition as you're playing with these different geometric shapes. Okay, so you have the scale of virtual objects are very distinct when you go into these virtual worlds. So this is from Cardoso. He's looking at the impact world where he's doing these different metaphors of the environment and having these different objects, and he's working on the immersive web. And so you go around into these virtual environments, and when you see these different objects that you can interact with, you get a sense of how, and sense of scale, how they're related to each other. So there's also, Andre has this whole visualizing the impacts of climate change with immersive technology. So this is actually there's a number of different immersive story pieces that I've seen on the film festival circuit that are trying to do this very difficult thing, which is how do you take something that is as large as climate change and connect it to a direct embodied experience? It's very, very difficult to do. And in this paper, in this video, they're actually digging into what was called the psychological distance from climate change. It's very abstract. It's referred to, like Tim Morton's has a philosophical idea called an hyperobject, which is like many different scales of complexity across many different generations. And so it's really difficult to wrap your mind around. But are there different ways that you can have an immersive experience that kind of connects to the relational dynamics that are happening for how our actions are impacting the world around us? And so for me, this is kind of tying back into this deeper paradigm shift into process relational philosophy, where a lot of the themes that I see again and again in immersive experiences are trying to connect the dots of the relational dynamics of how our actions and behaviors over time are impacting the world around us. And are there ways that you can be in a virtual environment to reveal these invisible platonic influences in a way that allows us to have an embodied experience with it? And then once that happens, can we change our behaviors? Okay, let's see. All right, so there's a mixed reality spectrum. There's some augmented reality experiences where from Huang et al., they're starting to have these AR-based materials library for higher education with these QR codes, and in the video you're kind of moving around, but the whole idea is that you can't have, when you're in virtual reality, you have all of your physical environment is occluded, but when you're in augmented reality, you're able to change the context. So in VR, you're completely switching context, but within AR, you're modulating your context with the center of gravity of your existing context, and you have these objects that are sort of shifting what the meaning of that existing context is. Okay, so a big theme is teaching procedural knowledge, both from medical applications, but that just basically means things that you have to do a series of steps, and it's about learning what those embodied actions are. And so during the whole Center for Academic Innovation, there was a extended reality at Michigan Summit that was digging into a lot of these different XR applications last month, and this particular experience was around trying to see if they were able to make nurses practice ready by having these virtual simulations, because nurses only get to interact with a couple of patients, but how do you simulate them interacting with like 5 or 6 patients at the same time in an environment that is in a virtual environment where if they mess up, they're not going to put anybody's life in danger. Okay, so then another aspect of embodied and environmental presence is the spatial visualization with like magnets of being able to actually see those fields that are invisible, but again, it's kind of, revealing the invisible fields and being able to see them and have different, representations of the right-hand rule. Then you have the gallery to explore different 3D models. So again, just being in these immersive spaces to actually have an embodied experience with these 3D objects, including multimodal embodied data from Kim et al. So finding all different ways of kind of getting different aspects of someone's brain waves, their eye gaze, their facial expression, heart rate, sweat, time, performance. So as we move on, we're going to have all this physiological and biological data that's being radiated. And is there a way to capture that and give real-time feedback to say, what is our cognitive load at the given moment? Or are we more stressed? So can you start to modulate and have more dynamic experiences based upon the physiological reactions that you're capturing from someone? So Jiang had this whole, I think it's exponent self embodied journey, which was really quite fascinating, where just kind of going through this whole journey. I'll go through some of these other slides. So first you pick an avatar creation and you're trying to represent your identity. And so it's a piece that's trying to allow you to discover your identity from virtual reality to reality. So you go through, picking an avatar and then going into these different worlds. You have different aspects of your identity, which is not only your embodiment, but all the different contextual domains that you're involved with. And so, the way I think about that is through these different contextual domains that I've explored in other contexts through my ethics work. But basically, context is very important. As you go into different contexts, you have your home and family, entertainment, enterprise, career, spirituality, religion. So if you go back and look at, you see a lot of overlap between these different contextual domains that are representing your identity, because identity is relational. It's relational to these different contextual domains. And depending on what context you represent your identity in different ways. So in this experience by Jiang, you're going through this kind of self-dialogue in a VR avatar where you're able to kind of give therapy to yourself. So this is work building upon the work of Mel Slater, where, if you're talking to a mirror, it's different than if you kind of record yourself talking to yourself, because you can give advice to someone else, but sometimes it's very difficult to give advice for yourself. So a lot of really fascinating work that Mel Slater has been doing that's being explored here in this whole journey that you can see going through all these different phases. So quite an ambitious project, and I'm curious to see how this ends up. Okay, so offboarding and onboarding, this is from Mishra. This is a part of the environmental context. And so whenever you're going into an experience and coming out of an experience, this is something that the immersive storytelling at film festivals think a lot about. There's like a whole installation that allows you to kind of enter into the magic circle before you enter into the experience, and then taking care for coming out of the experience. What is the experience that is able to kind of create this liminal space that allows you to go back into the experience? And so this is some of the different studies and research of different best practices for offboarding and onboarding. So recommend digging into more of that, kind of scaffolding your users and to help kind of prime them to be able to experience this immersive experience. Okay, so moving on to active presence. So that was all the embodied environmental presence. So active presence, this is all about agency and interactivity. There was one experience that was applying virtual reality for immersive experiential learning in underserved rural areas. And so this was like they were doing kayaking, they were climbing up different mountains, they were taking pictures of penguins, an experience that was very much about them taking action and they were embodied in these worlds, but it was more about them interacting and playing in this world. So very much in the center of gravity of active presence in this experience. And then you have motivation and engagement. There's a lot of different things in this, but I'm just trying to highlight both the motivation and inspiration and engagement. It's sometimes very difficult to kind of have a static photo that represents engagement, but it's all about how do you express your agency and actually interact and engage with the different content. I'm sure that each of the different experiences that are being featured here have some degree of interactivity and agency that are being shown here. So this was a slide that was from Justin Barry, where he was talking about empowering the next generation of creators. And he had just a whole collection of verbs for educators to think about, how can you start to make something more active rather than passive, and get whatever, what are the verbs that you can start to engage with these different experiences. And so that's a good starting point to make sure that it's not just you going into an experience and then just watching something passively, but you're actually dynamically engaged with using your body to interact with the world around you. Okay, so moving on to emotional presence. So this is a lot of the different dimensions of immersive storytelling that I've seen, where it's a lot about trying to tell a story and create a context where you are sometimes you are the protagonist where it's about you in the story, but sometimes for more of the emotional experiences, you don't actually have a lot of agency. You're just like a ghost. You're watching something unfold from a third-person perspective, and it's more about listening to other people's stories and being transported into their context so that you can maybe sympathize or empathize with their experiences a little bit more. That was a theme that I saw come up again and again, and it's something that I've dug deep into throughout the course of my coverage. I'd say that the film festivals like Sundance and South by Southwest and Tribeca and Venice and Doc Lab, these are the frontiers of what's happening of immersive storytelling. And I try to make sure that I'm going to those different events and seeing all the different experiences. And I've done that since 2016. And so that's kind of a beat that I've been tracking very closely. And I've given other talks about that, that I don't have time to really dig into some of the other aspects of storytelling within VR. But I'll have a link to a slide about presence that I'll point to you later that you can go check that out if you want more information on that. But anything about like arts and culture and speculative cultures and exhibitions, and it's this kind of aesthetic quality of these different art pieces that are trying to evoke different feelings in you. And there was a survey of how different media were covering the war in Colombia. This was a piece by Lotero and Rice looking at immersive media and war reporting in Colombia. Doing a survey, but 360 videos is something that is much more engaging into the emotional presence, mostly because you can't actually engage or change the outcome of the experience. You can certainly look around, so there is a sense of embodiment, but you can't change anything, so it's not active in a way. So it's more of you have embodied agency, but no narrative agency, let's say. But most of the 360 videos I find are very impactful for moving your emotions. So recommend lots of different experiences there if you want to kind of check that out more. So empathy and empathizing with autism from Bakare. So this is an experience where they're actually showing this piece that's a 360 video on YouTube from the National Autistic Society that was published in 2016. And it kind of mimics what someone with autism would see or experience with sensory overload, both from the auditory, but also visually. And it kind of modulates your experience. And as people go through this experience, you get a bit of a deeper sense of what it means to have autism. And so this is a way of kind of building empathy and building emotional connection with what other people are going through. So moving on to mental and social presence, because this is the iLRN conference, by and far, most of the experiences that we're talking about are the center of gravity of mental and social presence, not only because you're trying to expand your mind and learn, but also there's a lot of social dynamics as well. So, oops, I forgot to put a title here, but this is Jiang, who's sort of putting this kind of hierarchy of both yourself, family, community, United States, these larger contexts of these different communities as you're embedded into these different contexts. And so, immersive experiences are able to kind of tap into more of these communal aspects of these experiences. So Jeremy Bailenson, he gave a whole keynote talk at a couple of years ago that's online. So he's talking about having small group discussions with Engage. And one of the things that he found was that there was these moments of synchrony. So this time difference is as people are turning their head, there's a kind of social theory that as people are turning their head at the same time, that means that there's group cohesion and there's synchrony within that group. So because he was in Engage and had all this data that was being collected, he was able to do all sorts of like really deep empirical data and research from a social science perspective that you would never be able to really do maybe you'll be able to do it now with AI, but it would be a little bit less precise with kind of the pose estimation algorithms. But being embedded in virtual reality means that there's all this data that can start to reveal all these new dimensions of social dynamics. And so Jeremy Bailenson's been kind of digging into that with some of the different work that he's been working on. There was a paper by Dimitri on the theory of cognitive load, both from the intrinsic and extrinsic. And so the whole idea of this paper was trying to get a sense of, when you go in an immersive experience, it's very overwhelming. And if this is your first VR experience, then you could be overwhelmed with cognitive load where it's so new that you're just trying to get a sense of the technology that you're kind of missing what's happening in the actual experience. And so are there ways to start to prime or get people ramped up to speed so that the first experience of virtual reality isn't so overwhelming? So again, sort of an aspect of the mental presence of trying to reduce that aspect of cognitive load. So there's a really beautiful piece by Cicero, dialogue-based story interactions with these hyper-stylized avatars, but as you go through it, it's a lot about just reading these text prompts. And so the experience is that you're doing a lot of reading, and the narration is more from, rather than listening to it, you're doing the reading. So it's more from that kind of literature, graphic novel type of fusion within the immersive environments. Or I think this may actually be like a 2D experience. Soft skills, so being able to train people in soft skills is something that I see a lot with these different immersive experiences, being able to go in and, especially with artificial intelligence as we start to move forward, having different ways that you can basically have a walk through the different pattern. If you're like, let's say, working at a hotel and you have to go through a lot of these different steps, engage with different people. So soft skills training is a big theme that I see within AI and immersive media. Teach Live was back in 2005. It was really pioneering this idea of Wizard of Oz techniques, where there's one person that's puppeteering a whole classroom of different people. And so there was a video that I think it might actually be Teach Live, or if not, it's something that is very much inspired by this kind of Wizard of Oz technique of having one or multiple people puppeteering these avatars so that you can allow teachers to be able to get the experience of teaching an entire classroom, even though it may be only one person that's driving it on the back end. So being able to kind of scale up. And maybe this is another example of where artificial intelligence in the future is going to be able to do that. But at this moment, having a live actor who's able to very directly guide a pedagogical intention is something that I think may take a while before AI is going to replace that. But I think that's on the road where we're going, is to have AI in these different types of virtual environments. So there's an AI NPC with building a virtual PC by Balance, where you're building a PC and there's integrating with different aspects of OpenAI. So here at this conference, starting to see different integrations with AI-driven NPCs. You have another AI-driven avatar. It's hard sometimes to know whether or not, when they say AI, if it's like machine learning, OpenAI, or it's just computer AI. Sometimes you just have algorithmically, heuristically driven AI, but this is another example of AI avatars from Dimitri. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about assessment and theories of change, and then dig into AI ethics and privacy. So there was one experience that was looking at heat maps to be able to analyze behavior. And so being able to track where people are looking and then export that data and import it into Unity. So getting into more empirical ways of being able to assess what people were paying attention to, or whether or not maybe you can extrapolate as to whether or not people understand or not. Again, I think there's always going to be a leap between what you can do quantitatively and qualitatively, but at least you're able to get some aggregate details as to what the people that are going through an experience are looking at. So these kind of like spatial heat maps is a really interesting concept that was shown by Yano. And then Ferrer was talking about how sometimes there's going to be the professor in the immersive experience observing, or sometimes they're outside watching from afar. And there was a whole looking at Salcedo. Actually, let me show this first. Oh, I guess I deleted it. I'll say this: the SAMR, the substitute, augmentation, modification, redefinition. So that whole idea where you're able to have these tiered systems where you first have the substitution that is a kind of one-to-one replacing something. So in this case, it's going from tablet to a spatial dimension. Maybe there might be a slight improvement there with the spatial dimension, and then you start to enhance it. So this is, as you start to propagate these technologies out with improved functionality. So actually in situ, as you're in the room, maybe having real-time rendering of these different CAD drawing or these different CAT scans. And then transformation, the modification is the first stage of the transformation, where you start to maybe have social dynamics where everybody's looking at the same model at the same time and having a group discussion, where that'd be very difficult to do before. And then you have a complete redefinition where you're able to do completely new things that you weren't able to do before with either the social dynamics or the spatial affordances of the medium. And that's where you eventually want to get with the technology, but it's a staged approach where you kind of have to take it one step at a time, from substitution to augmentation, modification, and then into the frontiers of what's completely redefining all these technologies. Striver has a whole scaling of mentorship training where you can see on the left side is the training effectiveness with very high, ability to scale with the manuals, but it's not very effective. it's more effective to do one-on-one training, and you can see that VR is kind of like up in a realm where there's no other technologies that are there. So it's really, Jeremy Valenson says that AR is the killer app for, or training is the killer app for virtual and augmented reality. All right, so theories of change. We have Simon Wardley's model where he has this model of technology evolution, where you're going from a Genesis custom-built application to product to commodity. So you have these distinct phases where you have an academic idea, it's proven out. You have the custom bespoke enterprise that's shipped out, and then you have the consumer product, and then it's eventually maybe it becomes the ubiquitous commodity. So with VR back to the 60s, you have the sword of Damocles. In the 90s, you had VPL with the $1 million silicon graphics machines, and then now we have consumer VR from 2013 to the present, where we are able to buy it for a couple $100 and be able to have access for what used to cost millions of dollars in the late 90s and late 80s and early 90s. And then eventually we may get to this stage of ubiquitous commodity, but we don't know when that may happen. But if you look at these different phases, you can see that a lot of stuff that's happening here are these academic research and maybe deploying it at more of a bespoke scale. But eventually we're going to get to where there's a lot of commercial off-the-shelf products that just make it a lot easy. But a lot of stuff that you have to do with these experiences is a lot of like building everything from scratch. So this is the Samer model where you have redefined modification, augmentation, and substitution. And there's Anderson's theory of change, which essentially is trying to map out all of the preconditions and intermediate outcomes until you eventually get to the long-term outcome. And this was shown in Van Husel, and trying to think about these kind of theory of change in the context of deploying these different immersive experiences. Okay, so the last section here is the AI ethics and privacy. So again, I gave like a half-hour talk just on my preliminary thoughts on AI. So I just have like 5 or 6 minutes left in this talk. I'm not going to be able to go into any great detail, but again, I'd refer to you. I just posted this on my YouTube channel that you can go check out that talk that gives into a lot more context. But a brief history, very, very brief history, going back to 1956 is when AI was coined. And we're going to skip ahead to 1999, where you have the GPUs to have parallel processing. And then you have the rise of computation that's been increasing since 1940 to 2020. It went from 10 flops to 10 billion petaflops. So you see this huge scale of computation that as the computation has been increasing, you have more and more capabilities for these artificial intelligence, or more accurately, the machine learning that we kind of broadly refer to as artificial intelligence. ImageNet in 2009, they got a whole bunch of images, and they had folks on Amazon Turk and just label those data. So once you have the images with the labels, then you're able to do the training and have a benchmark. And then in 2012 is when you had this breakthrough in deep learning revolution with both the compute power, and the algorithms had been there for like over a decade, but it wasn't until the GPU and that trained data was able to have these benchmarks that catalyzed this whole deep learning revolution. And then AlphaGo beats Lee Sedol in 2016. And then you have these large language models, which I just wanted to pin here because this is 2018, 2020. This is something that I think people have been very surprised to see the capabilities of what it means to scrape the internet and come up with what's called autoregressive large language models, meaning they have no idea what word they're going to say next. They can't plan, they can't think ahead. There's no common sense reasoning. It's all just kind of like statistical probabilities of whatever the next word is. But even despite that, it still does an amazing job of kind of mimicking what a human would sound like. But there's lots of different downsides to that, which Jan LeCun has. He's one of the chief AI researchers at Meta. He says that large language models are doomed. And he's done some math where, if you look at what tokens are correct or incorrect, basically you're always going to have aspects of these large language models just making up stuff. They're hallucinating. They're going to get facts wrong. They're going to spread misinformation. So they're basically like, they can get some stuff right, but they get a lot of stuff wrong. And the stuff they get wrong actually disproportionately hurts specific demographics and populations. So there's a famous stochastic parrots paper by AI ethicists that calls these large language models stochastic parrots, meaning that they're just kind of mimicking without any deeper idea of what they're saying, what they're doing. So there's a lot of AI ethicists that are pushing back against what is I perceive as a lot of AI hype. There's certainly a lot of capabilities with generative AI, but there's also a lot of downsides. Things like Google just firing all their AI ethicists. They're trying to raise the red flag and set the alarm, but despite that, they're just pushing ahead without any sense of responsible innovation. And then Kirby Ferguson has a whole video on YouTube where he's arguing that all of these things that AI are doing is what all humans have been doing, which is remixing culture, and that everything is a remix. And so he's really giving a strong argument for fair use. But on the other side, there's these lawsuits from artists who are suing these companies, saying that you can actually, kind of denoise what's happening, and there's basically like a copy within these models that are essentially like stealing the intellectual property. So is it fair use, or is it a fair use with transformation, or is it basically stealing those images? So this is an active debate, but it's worth knowing that, to what degree is it ethically gathered, the data that's being trained on. And a lot of times they won't even tell us what data it's being trained on. It's a grand mystery, which makes it very difficult to kind of intellectually, honestly evaluate the capabilities and the downsides and the threats of some of these large language models when they're not being transparent as to what they're training it on or what their architectures are. So then you have things like bias in AI, where if you do search for a CEO in some of these generative AI models, it'll come up with basically 100% white men, or just at least 100% men. And so you have these different degrees that it's kind of replicating the things it's trained on, but also just amplifying it in a way that it's not always aware of. So you have a whole documentary called Coded Bias, which is covering the aspect of algorithmic bias, which is a great exploration for when you don't have training data for certain populations, then it's going to bring undue harm for those. And because of that undue harm, then you have the AI Act that's currently going through the trilogue process in the European Union. And through that process, they're trying to come up with ways to regulate artificial intelligence. And they have this tiered system. And so there's things that are prohibited. So that's bringing too much undue harm. Then you have high risk, they have limited risk, where both have different obligations of disclosure, both from the government for the high risk and both to the users to say, hey, you're engaging with a chatbot right now, that has to be disclosed. And then there's minimal risk where there's no obligation. So I point to the AI Act as the frontiers of where the most sophisticated regulation for AI is happening right now. And the United States is probably 5 or 10 years behind, even though there's at least some hearings, but in terms of like thinking about this, they've been working on this for 3 or 4 years now. All right, so again, I don't have time to really dig into ethics. I gave a talk on Law Virtual and other talks where I dig into, but I just wanted to just kind of end here with a few thoughts on privacy and ethics. And so you have things as we move forward, more and more neuroscience technologies, OpenBCI for things like EOG, EEG, EMG. So as time goes on, we're going to have more and more physiological sensors that are built into these headsets. Like this headset right now costs $22,000, so it's not something on the consumer frontier, but in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to start to see more of these, and there's going to be more and more implications of that. So here's a list of all these physiological and biometric data that may be integrated into immersive technologies within the next 5 to 10 years. And you have combining neurotech with VR. And then there's an existential threat to our privacy as we move forward. So eye tracking can do all sorts of different psychographic inferences from eye gaze data. So anybody that's using eye gaze data, what's happening to that data? Is it available? Who's it made available to? You can make all sorts of inferences that have privacy implications to them. And then as you move forward, there's all this data that have different dimensions of your behaviors, intentions, actions, and movements for active presence, your mental and social presence of mental thoughts, cognitive processes, cognitive load, social presence, and then the emotional presence of your affective state, emotional sentiment, facial expressions, micro expressions, and then the embodied presence of stress, arousal, physiological reactions, eye gaze, attention, body language, and muscle fatigue. So on the one hand, you'll be able to feed all this data and to make more and more immersive experiences and to know more about your students and to tune experiences for them. On the other hand, this data in the wrong hands is going to be able to psychographically profile us and be able to undermine some of our human rights. And Nina Farahani has a book called Battle for Your Brain, where she's talking about the right to self-determination, the right to freedom of thought, the right to mental privacy, which for her includes the physiological reactions and the affective reactions. So in this book, I did a deep dive interview with her, digging into what needs to happen, which is essentially we need to declare a new human right of cognitive liberty, which for her includes both the self-determination, freedom of thought, and mental privacy. And until that is declared, then that's going to ripple out into all these different laws. But there's also neuro rights that are trying to bring out different rights of mental privacy, identity, agency, fair access to the mental augmentation, and protection from algorithmic bias. But I think I just wanted to end on that aspect of the ethics and the future of cognitive liberty, because as amazing as these technologies are, there's some real threats to our privacy as we move forward. And it's just something to be aware of, and to also see that there's folks like Nina Farahani that are working towards trying to define these things from both a philosophical and legal and neuroscience perspective, so that we can start to establish these human rights so that we're not sleepwalking into a dystopia. So today I was able to cover some of the learning models, and then go over my elemental theory of presence, and then do a little bit of a tour of some of the iLRN papers through the lens of presence, look at assessment, and then theories of change, and then AI ethics and privacy. So, and then you can also look at this QR code to get my slides if you haven't yet, or look at the link in the description. And so with that, I think I'm ready to take some questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kent Bai. Wow, what a fabulous, really fabulous opening keynote for the iLRN 2023 conference.